EA at this point has a reputation for, among other things, canceling video game projects. Here are 7 examples of games they canceled that could have been awesome and possibly brought them millions of dollars. There's some cool stuff to dive into here. First up on the EA chopping block is Black 2. This one was canceled pretty early on in development, with the project never actually making it past the pre-production stage. According to Unseen64, Criterion and EA had plans to turn Black into a franchise way before the first game ever released. The sequel was set to be a co-op shooter and kind of a reboot of the series, with it not tying in directly to the first game and being more of a self-contained experience with a different vibe than the original game. There isn't too much information on what this different tone was going to be, but based off the concept art alone, you can get a bit of an idea. Black was a very drab and not colorful military shooter, but the concept art for its sequel is very colorful, with a cast that's obviously very much not in the military. It almost looks like these characters were ripped straight from one of the first 2 Fast and Furious movies. This seemed to cause a bit of a rift between EA and Criterion, actually causing senior designer Stuart Black to leave the studio over the direction of the game. He wanted it to tie more into the first game, while I'm assuming EA wanted to be this new, colorful, separate co-op shooter, which is what they ended up running with. The game was only mentioned publicly once by EA during a quarterly review, and soon after that is when production stopped because of a lack of direction. The game actually never left pre-production. I gotta be honest, I really wish we saw this game released. I would have loved to see the change in direction and what it actually looked like, but I guess we'll just never know. Next up at number 6, we have a Marvel fighting game that was being developed by EA Chicago that was rumored to be titled Marvel Destruction. This wasn't EA Chicago's first time making a fighting game. They're the team behind the very good Fight Night Round 3, and also the team behind the very not so good Def Jam Icon. Development for this game started off kind of rocky, with the pre-production team having already spent a good amount of time with very little to show for it, and the delayed Def Jam Icon didn't help either. The idea they had for Marvel Destruction was actually pretty solid, but may have sounded better on paper. They were going for a fighting game that wasn't very traditional. Arenas would be very big, spanning like 5 city blocks, and if you couldn't tell by the rumored title of the game, Destruction was a very big focus here. Fighters would get thrown through buildings, overhead train tracks would come crashing down, cars would be destroyed. It seemed like if it was there, it could be destroyed. They also had this very ambitious but cool idea where the city itself would weigh in on the fight. Citizens would side with one of the fighters, depending on which one was actively saving them and trying to not hurt them, with the other fighter who may not care as much and is ruining everyone's day being turned on and having citizens attack them. There's actually a piece of concept art that shows Hulk standing on a construction crane with a note on the art saying crane operator trying to shake the Hulk off would rule. I do really think that is a good idea. I can't help but think of Spider-Man and how New York City is kind of its own character. Seeing how the city interacts with him has always been some of the best stuff to come out of these comics, movies, and games. Eventually, EA Chicago was shut down by EA, with their Marvel game getting canned with them. It seems that they were shut down for a few reasons. Poor performance from Def Jam Icon, and Marvel Destruction's development being super rocky being 2 contributing factors. At the time of closing, EA Games president Frank Cabot had this to say: "We're willing to take risks, make long-term investments, and support teams and individuals between launches, but each team is responsible for staying on a reasonable path to profitability. Sticking to that strategy is what gives us the financial resources and flexibility to take risks on new projects. Unfortunately, EA Chicago hasn't been able to meet that standard. The location has grown dramatically in the past 3 years, while revenue from the games developed there has not." It's always a bummer to see a studio get shut down, especially when what they were working on could have eventually become something really cool, or just very okay, like Def Jam Icon. Next, number 5, we have to talk about a canceled project from Visceral Games. According to Unseen64, this one was going to be called Bloodlust and was going to be a multiplayer shooter. It was set in the 1930s where 3 factions were fighting over a drug called Bloodlust. 2 of these factions were just normal dudes wielding guns, and the 3rd faction was made up of different monsters. This was supposedly going to be a multiplayer mode that was attached to another canceled game called The Ripper, which was a game based off of Jack the Ripper, until they were separated and were going to be released separately before EA canceled both titles. There honestly isn't too much information out there about this project other than that it existed. There is some gameplay footage out there, and it was supposedly very close to being done, making it more than halfway through its development cycle. It looked kind of fun. There's a lot of games of these types now, but seeing Visceral's take on it could have been interesting. Next to number 4, in the mid-2000s, EA Los Angeles was working with legendary director Steven Spielberg on a game called Elemeno, also referred to as The Escape Artist. Apparently the game was supposed to be, and I quote, a mix of first-person parkour movement with adventure RPG objectives and escape-focused gameplay, all based around the player's relationship with an alien-looking character named Eve. When it was first announced, there was emphasis on the game's intent to evoke emotion from the player, which is evidenced in one of the few trailers we got for the game, which ended with a black end slate saying, "Can a computer game make you cry?" This makes sense given the content of a now infamous quote from Steven Spielberg weighing in on the age-old games as art debate, where he said, "I think the real indicator that games have become a storytelling art form will be when somebody confesses that they cried at level 17. So yeah, it seems like a logical move that a game he worked on would aim for that exact emotional resonance. The game was set to be an action-adventure title for the Xbox 360 and PlayStation 3 and was reportedly in development for like 5 years, from 2005 all the way to 2010, which is not an insignificant amount of development time for any game, let alone one that got canned. That said, it wasn't in full development for the entirety of that span, as EA laid off the majority of the dev team and shifted the focus of the game to a more traditional action game, which, according to Unseen64, was said to be more in the vein of other popular action games of the time like Uncharted, as the original concept was seen as too ambitious. When the game never saw the light of day, we did find out a little more in a feature published on 1UP. In the article, it stated that the deal with EA had Spielberg signed up for 3 titles, but the Elemeno was the only one locked in, and that there was no team assigned when the deal went through. The piece also details more about the gameplay, which reiterates again that the player would alternate between the role-playing objectives, like talking to characters and getting information and whatnot, as well as action sequences that implemented escape gameplay, which would see players running away from helicopters and FBI agents that were too intense to take head-on. When paired with the first-person parkour elements, seems like it may have influenced the 2008 EA title Mirror's Edge. While it's a shame that this Spielberg collaboration never saw the light of day, there actually was one of the 3 planned games that did make it out to the store shelves, which, oddly enough, was Bloom Blocks, a Wii exclusive where you tried to knock down blocks by throwing a ball at them, which, ironically enough, seems about as far from the famed director's plans to create a game with emotional resonance as you can get. And at number 3, EA honestly can't just seem to gain any traction when it comes to Command & Conquer games. Take, for instance, the simply named Command & Conquer. Originally announced as Command & Conquer Generals 2, EA was so confident that this would be a thing that people wanted that it was announced at the 2011 Spike TV Video Game Awards. Developed by Victory Games, the game was supposed to be a straight-up sequel to Command & Conquer Generals. But that all changed in August of 2012, where the Generals 2 moniker was dropped, and it was announced that the game would simply be titled Command & Conquer, and would now be a free-to-play game. After that, they went mostly radio silent with the game until people were actually able to get their hands on it, and when the reception was less than stellar, the studio tried to adjust the game based on player feedback, but it didn't change enough, and after a lot of negative fan feedback over the economy-based multiplayer experience, the game was officially cancelled in October of 2013. It was a real harbinger of things to come with the franchise, with the most recent Command & Conquer Rivals mobile game that, while not cancelled, saw its one fair share of controversy based on its microtransactions and the like. Sure, there's a chance that they can see the value in the franchise again and put out a really good Command & Conquer game, but honestly, we're not holding our breath. Now at number 2. Okay, now this one is a rough development tale if we've ever heard one, and it's one that we still think about a lot years later. So the first we heard of this was in May of 2013, hot on the heels of the Walt Disney Company's newly signed agreement that gave EA the exclusive license for Star Wars games on consoles. At that point in time, all we knew is that a game was coming, and it was coming from Visceral Games, developers of the Dead Space franchise. It wasn't until 2014 that Amy Hennig, the director and writer for games like Uncharted and Soul Reaver, came into the scene to be the creative director for the project. As EA started staffing up and really getting into development for the game, now codenamed Ragtag, we finally got an idea of what the game was actually going to be. The vision for the game was said to be a linear adventure, much like the previous work Hennig had done on the Uncharted franchise, and was going to focus around a heist, with you planning it out and getting your crew together to ultimately pull the heist off, and was going to feature things like the ability to switch between members of the crew while AI controls your other members, and would let you sneak around and sabotage enemies to take them out in a more non-violent stealthy way. This was described in pretty good detail in a 2017 article by Kotaku's Jason Schreier, where an anonymous member of the development team said the following. Picture the Death Star and they all have jobs. One stormtrooper was on a command unit moving boxes around. Some guys would be droids. It was supposed to be set up so it was all real, and it felt like they had jobs to do. We wanted to tap into emotions so you could mess with stormtroopers' emotions. Go into a room, turn the lights off. He goes back in and turns them back on. Then you turn them off again. At a certain point, he starts getting spooked, acting irrationally, and bringing friends in. It seems wildly ambitious, considering that the team working on the project was said to be about only 30 people. Serious development issues arose again when EA made the demand that the studio use a Frostbite 3 engine that was developed by DICE for the Battlefield franchise, with another member of the team explaining that there were just fundamental problems getting it to do what they needed to do for the game. It was missing a lot of tools, a lot of stuff that was in Uncharted 1. It was going to be a year or a year and a half's work just to get the engine to do the things that are assumed and taken for granted, they said. That's not to mention the issues they came into working with the license, which required everything be vetted and approved by Lucasfilm and Disney. It wasn't until E3 2016 that we actually saw a quick snippet of the game in motion as part of a montage and nothing else. It was a brief look into an ultimately doomed game. Between then and October 2017, the studio saw more development issues and layoffs before Visceral Games was ultimately shuttered completely and the project given to EA Vancouver, who attempted to salvage as many assets as possible while shifting it from a single-player adventure game to a multiplayer games as a service type deal, with not much of anything by way or news coming out about it again until early 2019 when the game was finally canceled for real. It's a real shame because in the time since, people have actually seen it in motion behind closed doors and have since come out to say that not only was the game further along than you would have led to believe, but what Visceral was working on actually looked really cool and pretty in line with that original vision. But unfortunately, we'll never know what could have been. Finally, at number 1, this next one is definitely going to sting a little bit, and we apologize, but it's time to talk about Dead Space 4. During an interview with Eurogamer, former Visceral creative director Ben Wannett opened up about some of the things they had planned for Dead Space 4. It seemed like Visceral really wanted to right their wrongs after Dead Space 3, which obviously didn't do so well. They honestly had some really cool ideas too. The coolest was probably how the world itself worked. By the end of Dead Space 3, everything is kind of messed up and Visceral was going to run with that. They were going to take the thing from 3 where you would jump from ship to ship and really build that out. The player would be going from abandoned ship to abandoned ship looking for supplies to keep your ship running. That creative director said, "I figured you'd start in a section of space, maybe following a trail of ship carcasses to an orbital station you think might have the parts and fuel needed to get your ship shock capable." This is how they would make Dead Space less linear, making it a bit of a hybrid with linear and non-linear parts. He also went on to talk about how the team did a great job with making the ship from the first game almost like a character, and they wanted to expand upon that and make a few of these ships truly unique and different. He went on to talk about how he would have liked to see Ellie as a playable character instead of Isaac, which may have been something really cool. Eventually, Visceral was moved to help work on Battlefield Hardline after Dead Space 3, and the 4th game was never greenlit because the series didn't bring in enough money, and Visceral had to go where the money was. That same creative director also talked about how they did have an ending for the game, saying this: "I don't want to give away the lore, but I will say that we spent a bit of time working out the origin of the necromorphs and what purpose humans held in this dark universe. Would players find a way out of the necromorph apocalypse? I'd say yes, but they might be sorry they did. Sometimes you're better off with the devil you know." He wouldn't give much more than that because he didn't want to spoil anything just in case EA decided to bring the series back, but I don't know how likely that is now that Visceral Games isn't around anymore. And those are 7 games that EA canceled, but we want to hear from you, so meet us down in the comments and let us know what you think. As I'm sure you already know, hitting that like button really helps us out, and if you're new here, subscribing is a good idea because we put out videos like this every single day. As always, thank you for stopping by and taking the time to hang out with us. We really appreciate it, and we'll see you next time right here on gameranx.